So we're going to be looking at the endocrine system, and we will divide this lecture into two different parts. So this will be part one, and then there will be a part two to follow. And even with this part one, it will be divided into multiple recordings. So make sure that you watch them all in order. So what we're going to look at is the endocrine system. Okay, so I want you to think about these different statements that I'm going to show, and you tell me what's the similarity between or among all of these different things. So first one is the onset of menses, right? So the onset of menses, the initiation of the first menstrual period, a drunk middle-aged male jumping off a bridge because his buddies dared him to. You donate a whole bunch of money to charity. You have a lack of ability to bring glucose into your cells, so this is occurring inside the body, of course. Urinating after a long night of drinking. We don't know anything about that. Strong uterine contractions during labor. I went a little too far. So all of these things, think about each one of these. They're obviously very different. Okay, so the onset of menses, uterine contractions, urinating a lot, donating a bunch of money to charity. Think about what all of these things have in common, and hint, think about something related to the endocrine system, right? So hopefully, something that you may have thought of is something that is causing all of these, and the answer is hormones. Okay, the answer is hormones. So hormones cause all of these different things to occur. So whether it's estrogen and progesterone for menses, if it's oxytocin for contractions, if it's anti-diuretic hormone that causes the urination, if it's insulin related to the glucose, if it's oxytocin related to donating money to charity, all of these things are caused by a hormone or a lack thereof, right? So what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at these various hormones, looking at the physiology and seeing how they affect the body in these various ways, right? So of course we're talking about the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is composed of endocrine glands, okay? Now you may be able to recall the difference between endocrine and exocrine, right? So exocrine organs or exocrine glands had a duct that then secreted or transported some substance onto a surface, onto an epithelial surface, right? So a good example of this is sweat, right? So you have a sweat gland, you have a duct, and then the sweat travels onto the surface of an epithelial tissue, in which case is our skin, right? Or you could think of saliva, right? Salivary glands are exocrine glands. So endocrine, endo meaning within, one difference, there are several differences, but one of them is how they secrete their products and where those products go, right? And also what those products are, right? So big thing is they lack ducts, okay? So they are ductless glands here, and they go into the blood, right? They're going into the blood. That is a extremely important aspect of the endocrine system, is the fact that the hormones, the messengers of the endocrine system, go into the blood, and then from the blood, the hormones can go somewhere in the body, right? And often they're traveling a great distance from their initial cell that produced them, right? The cells that they're traveling to are called target cells, and importantly, any cell or any cell type that has a receptor for a given hormone is a target cell, right? So a muscle cell that has a growth hormone receptor is a target cell for growth hormone, right? Our various cells that have receptors for insulin, for bringing in glucose, are target cells for insulin, right? Importantly, a hormone can only bind to a cell if that given cell has a receptor that is specific to that given hormone, right? So you can think of this in a similar manner to almost like a lock and key mechanism, right? Your lock, or I'm sorry, your key to your house or to a door is only going to work if that lock matches up with it, right? So too, the hormone is only going to work, it's only going to function, it's only going to bring about its physiological effect if the cell has a receptor that is specific to that hormone, right? Now, the way that you get the hormone to that cell, right, is via what we said a second ago. You're releasing it into the blood, right? So the hormones are going to be released into interstitial fluid. If you recall from AMP1, that's just the fluid in the space in between the cells, in between tissues, right? From there, it enters the blood. It travels in the blood. We'll see exactly how it travels in the blood. It depends on the type of hormone. It will leave the blood at some point. It will enter the interstitial fluid again, and then it will bind onto a receptor on one of the target cells, right? And again, it has to be specific. So this is kind of an illustration of what we just said. So you have a cell that is secreting the hormone. Okay, so this purple structure here, this is the hormone, whatever it happens to be. It enters the interstitial fluid. It enters the blood. It travels in the blood. Notice it bypasses, or it does not bind to a cell that does not have a specific receptor, right? So it's the wrong receptor. It continues traveling until it meets up with a receptor that is specific to that hormone, right? Now, you may recall that the nervous system that you've already looked at, right? The nervous system is a similar type of system to the endocrine system in the sense that it is also a communication system, right? The nervous system and the endocrine system are both types of communication systems. We're sending a signal from one area of the body or from one cell to another cell, right? So think maybe for the nervous system, think muscle contraction, right? You're sending a signal from the nerve, from the neuron to a muscle to initiate some event. In that case, it may be muscle contraction, right? Or you're stimulating gastric secretions, or you're stimulating another cell to be excited, right? So in an action potential or something like that, right? Think about the things that were happening with the cell-to-cell communication in the nervous system, right? So you had neurotransmitters, right? Acetylcholine, epinephrine, something like that. The neuron would release those that acetylcholine, those neurotransmitters, onto a cell. It would bind to a receptor. And then something would happen, right? A protein channel would open and sodium would rush into the cell, something like that, right? But think about the proximity between the neuron and the cell that it is affecting, right? So the target cells, right? And you can see it in this illustration here. The neuron and these target cells are very close to each other, right? They're extremely close to each other. When we look at the endocrine system, that is not necessarily the case. Okay, the endocrine cell that is producing the hormone, it may be a great distance away from the target cell, right, that has the receptor on it. There may be some great distance. Now, great distance is a relative term, right? We have to put it in its context. In the context of being a very small microscopic hormone, right, a subcellular molecule, it's a great distance, right? It may be a couple of inches for us, or it may be a foot, or it may be several feet. But in the context of a small subcellular structure, that's a very great distance, right? So, for example, we release a hormone called thyroid stimulating hormone, and this is coming from our pituitary gland in our brain, and it is stimulating the thyroid. As the name would suggest, thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid, which is down in our neck, right? So we travel all the way from our brain all the way down to our neck. We also release from the anterior pituitary one called ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which stimulates the adrenal cortex, right? So in this case, it's even a greater distance. We're going from the pituitary gland in the brain all the way down to our adrenal glands, which sits right atop our kidney, right? So in that case, we're traveling several feet. If we just went a straight linear distance, we're traveling several feet. So we're traveling a good ways, right? Other differences have to do with the duration of the effects, right? So think of the nervous system. Typically, it's very rapid, but it's very short-lived, right? So you send a quick action potential down a neuron, stimulates a muscle, the muscle contracts very quickly, but then that signal is over, right? And your muscle relaxes, right? Unless you continue to send additional subsequent action potentials, right? So it's very quick, but it's usually short-lived, right? For hormones, right, it takes a little bit longer for the response to occur because, of course, it has to travel, right? But typically the effects of the hormone stimulation are typically a little bit longer lived. They last a little bit longer. So hormone levels in the morning can continue to affect an individual throughout the day. There's a great book that I recommend you look at some time. It's a relatively dense book. It's by a scientist named Dr. Robert Sapolsky. He teaches at Stanford, and the book is called Behave. And the premise of his book is what is causing human behavior at our best and at our worst. So what causes things in our behavior that are really, really good and pro-social and very helpful, and then what causes the type of behavior that is just very cruel and evil and things like that, right? And a lot of it has to do with hormones, hormone levels from a period in the day can cause you to act in certain ways later in the day, but it all has to do with hormones, and the effect and the emphasis here is that the effects are long lasting, right? They're longer lasting than what you have with the nervous system, right? So here we can see some various other functions of the endocrine system. So regulating growth, development, and metabolism. You may recall these are all characteristics of life, right? So things that we see in all living individuals. So regulating metabolism, regulating cell division, so things like growth hormone, regulating homeostasis of blood composition. So we'll talk about this a lot in AMP2. So we'll talk about things called, or a hormone called antidiuretic hormone. We'll talk about one called aldosterone. We'll talk about one called atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP. All of these are affecting something to do with our blood volume, and blood pressure, right? Controlling digestive processes. So when we get to our digestive system, we'll talk about various hormones, one called gastrin, right? Which stimulates gastric activity. You have others like insulin, right? So insulin's a very common hormone. You likely know a little bit about insulin from the pancreas, regulating blood glucose levels. Reproductive activities, we'll talk about this at the very end of the course when we get to reproductive systems, but the production of male and female gametes, so sperm in biological male and in the egg or ovum in biological female, these are controlled, their production is controlled by hormones, right? So here are a few questions that you can ask yourself kind of as a review thus far. So if we look at a few examples of endocrine glands, we've listed a few already, right? We said pituitary, I said pancreas a second ago, right? So these are these endocrine glands. They contain an epithelial tissue. They're releasing hormones, and some of them are what you can almost think of as dedicated endocrine organs, meaning their sole purpose in life, right, is to function as part of the endocrine system. That's their sole goal, right? That's their only job, right? So these are things like pituitary gland, pineal gland, right? Both of these are in the brain. We have the thyroid in the neck, the parathyroid, which are kind of on the posterior side of the thyroid gland, and then we have the adrenal glands that we mentioned earlier that sit right atop the kidney, right? The term adrenal means above or atop the renal, which is referring to kidney. You may also see those called the suprarenal glands as well. You then have other groups of cells that function as part of the endocrine system within some other structure, right, or some other organ, right? So meaning they have an endocrine function, but the structure or organ that they're a part of is not specific to the endocrine system, right? So things like hypothalamus. Hypothalamus has a big role to play in endocrine system, but it also has a lot to do with the nervous system as well, right? So controlling temperature regulation, hunger, things like this. Skin, we'll see this a little bit later on as we talk about some hormones related to the skin. Thymus, we'll talk about this a little bit when we do immune system. Heart, liver, stomach, pancreas, small intestine, so a lot of these having to do with the digestive system. Adipose tissue, kidneys, gonads, we'll talk about whenever we do reproductive system. So all of these structures, right, each one of these, the heart, the stomach, the kidneys, the gonads, the small intestine, these are not part of the endocrine system, but within these structures there are groups of cells that have an endocrine function, right? So that's the point of what we're talking about here. And as we get to these various lectures later on, and you look at these various systems, you'll see how the endocrine system plays a role, right? So here you can see various endocrine glands, right? So again, glands, these are specific to endocrine system, and then you have the organs and tissues that have some something to do with the endocrine system. They have some cells that play a role, but that's not their dedicated function, right? Now, for endocrine system, we already mentioned that you have a cell, it's going to make a hormone, the hormone's going to enter the blood, it's going to travel, and it's going to act on its receptor, right? Now, how does that initial cell produce a hormone? Well, there's kind of actually four main types, but we'll look at these three, right? First one is called hormonal stimulation. Just as a clue here, the type of stimulation is telling you what stimulates the cell to make the hormone, right? Whatever the hormone is, this type of stimulation is causing it to produce the hormone, the cell to produce the hormone. So hormonal stimulation, what stimulates the hormone to be produced? Another hormone, right? So hormonal stimulation. So the release of another hormone triggers the release of the hormone, right? So the example we gave earlier with thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid to release thyroid hormone, right? You have adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary, stimulates the release of corticotropin, right? Or some other hormone from the adrenal cortex, right? So maybe it's cortisol or something like that, right? You may have a gonadotropin, a gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is from the hypothalamus, stimulates the release of gonadotropes, which are a type of hormone from the pituitary, like follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, these have major roles in the reproductive system, as we'll see. So the big idea here is one hormone stimulates a cell or an organ to release another hormone. So hormonal stimulation. The second type is called humoral stimulation. Now this is sometimes confusing because one is hormonal and one is humoral. Okay, they look very similar and they're spelled very similar, but they're different, right? So humoral, okay, what does humoral mean? Think about what humoral means. Pause the video and think about what the term humor means, right? So humor, in this case, humoral, it does not mean something that is humorous, like funny, but humors refers to fluid, right? Fluid, like your body's humors, so some type of fluid in the body. So in this case, humoral stimulation, changes in the level of a nutrient or ion in the blood triggers release of hormone. So the blood here, that's the fluid. Okay, so something is in the fluid, i.e. the blood. That thing in the blood, its level, its amount changes, and that stimulates a hormone to be released, right? So the example they give here is glucose. The amount of glucose in the blood stimulates insulin to be released, right? An increased amount of glucose. It may be an increased amount of sodium, okay? It may be an increased amount of calcium, okay? Or a decreased amount of calcium and it stimulates parathyroid hormone to be released, right? So we'll talk about that. So the idea here is something in the blood is stimulating a hormone to be released. Humoral, right? Humoral. The third type here is called nervous stimulation. So meaning what stimulates a hormone to be released? The nervous system, right? And so in this case, we have a sympathetic stimulation of our adrenal gland, right? So the adrenal gland is kind of unique. When we talk about the autonomic nervous system, you may recall from AP1, the autonomic nervous system is divided into kind of two divisions, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, and they all contain or consist of a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron, right? Well, in the case of this adrenal pathway, you have one long preganglionic axon, right? So that starts here in the lateral horn, goes through the ventral root, spinal nerve, and through this white ramus, sympathetic chain ganglia. It leaves and it travels all the way down through other ganglia to the adrenal gland, and then the adrenal medulla essentially acts like the postganglionic neuron. That's essentially what it's serving as. And so in this case, you have this long fiber, stimulates the adrenal medulla. Well, in the adrenal medulla, we have catecholamines. And catecholamines are things like epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? Now, those two hormones, those should look familiar to you because we looked at those in AMP1 whenever we did autonomic nervous system, right? They were acting in that case as neurotransmitters because they were released from a neuron, right? A nerve. So in this case, if it is released from a gland, epinephrine or norepinephrine, it's a hormone, or it's functioning as a hormone. If it's released from a neuron, then it's acting as a neurotransmitter, right? But it's the same molecule regardless, right? But these are three main types of endocrine stimulation, right? So we're going to stop here with this first part of part one, and then we're going to pick up with part two, start looking at some types of hormones, and then we'll go on from there.